The Vikings have mostly been remembered for being fearsome pirates and warriors. However, their wanderlust and yearning for adventure often manifested itself in more peaceful forms. If you saw the approaching sails of a Viking ship, they were just as likely to be merchants as they were pirates. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson spoke of a king who sometimes traveled as a Viking, sometimes as a trader. His name was Björn Farman. Farman, or farmathur, was the Norse word for a traveling or seafaring merchant. It can roughly be translated as traveler or wayfarer. Far means traveling, and man means man. So it literally means traveling man. In modern Icelandic, farmathur has survived as their word for sailor. The title of Farmen had as much weight and prestige as Viking. Whilst Viking was attributed to powerful pirates or warriors, so too was farmathur, only bestowed upon the most reputable of seafaring merchants. As we saw in the example of King Björn Farman, it was sometimes granted as a name. The title of farmathur was exclusive because it didn't include those who went on short trips to your local market. These were men like Vesten Vestensson, who traveled from Iceland to Denmark and then to England. However, many Norse went on such voyages, but do not seem to have been bestowed the title of farman. This might indicate that farmathur was only the title of those who took long-distance trading as a long-term profession and excelled at it, rather than those who only went trading every now and then. Indeed, it was common for pretty much every ambitious Viking to go trading every now and then. Their economic system was laissez-faire to say the least, being dynamic and very free. There were very few restrictions and few taxes on trading. Bandamanna Saga is perfect for explaining the Viking economy. In this tale, a young man, Odd, is treated coldly by his wealthy father, Ofeg. Odd asks his father for some money so that he can move out, but Ofeg refused to give him anything considerable. So, Odd takes some fishing tools and departs without even saying goodbye. He joins a group of fishermen and borrows or rents whatever equipment he needs. Anything he purchases, he pays off over time. His team of fishermen eventually become the most successful, and after 3 years, Odd has paid off all his debts and still made profit. Odd got into trading and bought shares in a shipping ferry. This meant that he got parts of the profit made from the ferry. He continued this trade until he had made a name for himself. By then he owned his own ship and most of the cargo. You see, a ship, and especially its cargo, was seldom just owned by one person, but rather by a conglomerate of investors and traders. In this sense, the Viking trade economy was sort of similar to modern stocks. Anyway, Odd bought a second ship, and it was said that he was the richest trader in the region. Eventually, he purchased his own land and became a wealthy possessor of gold, silver, soil, and cattle. However, Odd never traveled farther than the Icelandic coast, and I presume this to be the reason why he was never called farmathur. Still, the anecdote does a good job of explaining the Viking economy to us. Firstly, anyone with the ambition and will to labor could work his way into wealth, at least on Iceland. Odd's noble upbringing didn't matter. He never associated with his father and never visited him. Likewise, some sagas tell of hard-working thralls that were liberated after good service and became reputable in their own right. Secondly, trading ships, and especially their cargo, were collectively owned by anyone able to invest in a share. This gave them a slice of the profits equal to their own share. This merchant system would persist throughout the medieval and early modern periods, and kind of survives to our day in the form of stocks. I'm not sure if it was practiced by earlier civilizations like the Greeks or Romans. Now let's look at the ships in particular used by the Farmen. There wasn't kind of any archetypal Farmen ship that all of them used. They came from all over the Nordic diaspora, and would have used the ships most appropriate for the region. In the North Sea, it was most necessary to use highly seaworthy vessels. Warships were designed to be fast and flexible. They were straight, narrow, long, called longships for a reason. They were primarily propelled by oars, carried a large crew, and moved very fast. Cargo vessels, on the other hand, were primarily propelled by sail and had a smaller crew, leaving more space for cargo. Due to the smaller crew, the cargo ship had fewer oars, if any. These were mostly used for maneuvering in harbors. The cargo ships had a rounded shape, allowing them to carry more cargo. Since they traveled farther into open seas, they had higher freeboards, so that water was less likely to get in and swamp the boat. They had a thicker hull and better stability, owing to the ballast stones in their bottom. On a warship, the crew served as ballast. The knurr or knarr is regarded as the most important cargo ship of the Viking Age. A prominent feature was their half-deck, meaning that there was a large opening in the deck amidships, where cargo was stored. These ships were regarded as status symbols, and sometimes mentioned as royal gifts. They were vital for colonizing the North Sea, but outside of that region, runic inscriptions have mentioned their usage in the Baltic Sea, and even as far down as Greece. Smaller than the knurr was the byrdinger. It was mainly used for coastal trade in Norway, particularly for transporting fish, but it was also found in the Baltic, and appears to have survived in Germany and Poland. Aside from being smaller than the knurr, it was largely similar. It only had oars in the fore and aft, the cargo was stored amidships, and the mast was fixed. It only had oars in the fore and aft, the cargo was stowed amidships, and the mast was fixed. However, the byrding carried a special byrding sail, and some believe the byrdinger had a flat bottom. Captured byrdings could easily be transformed into warships by patching up the midsection and adding more oars. Special vista byrdinger were used for transporting food for the Leithanger, the Viking navy. What about trade goods? Iceland was largely lacking in natural resources, and their most important export was sheepskin and textiles. In Scandinavia, the most important export to the east were skins and furs. The route to the east was undertaken via a network of rivers and waterways that we will discuss in depth in an upcoming video. Whilst the knurr has been described at least once as being used in Greece, historians do believe that the ships travelling eastward were much lighter. For one, most of the farmen travelling east were Swedish. The ships found in Sweden were much lighter than those in Norway, Denmark or Iceland. This allowed the crewmen to easily carry them on landmasses between two waterways. The sails on these vessels were quite small, and archaeological evidence points to them being used in the trading metropoly of Birka. The previous definitions of farman and farmathur are the official ones, but I do have some personal speculation that the word might be related to the word farm, which likewise exists in modern Scandinavian languages. That is because in early medieval Sweden, and especially the island of Gotland, the farmen were powerful landholders that were both farmers and traveling merchants. These were sometimes called farmans bönder, meaning farmer farmen, or I guess farmer merchants. Gotland was a trading metropoly throughout the Viking and Middle Ages. Located smack dab in the Baltic Sea, it served as a perfect midpoint between east and west. The island housed several natural harbors that were perfect for trading, and laws were written down on how the owners were to treat their ships in these locations. Gotland is home to several runestones that bear witness to some of the greatest farmen. These were written in the Gotlanders' own language, Gutnish, and one allegedly speaks of two farmen that traveled to Iceland, Greece, Jerusalem, and Arabia. They brought home with them great hoards of silver, and massive treasures from the Viking Age had been found in the farmlands around Gotland. Many of the coins stem from the Byzantine and Arabic worlds, indicating at far-flung trade connections. The Gotlanders traded skins and furs, but also dried fish, salt herring, whale oil, wooden products, and falcons, which were used in hunting. Around the year 1000, the trading harbors faded out of usage. This was because the Gotlanders started using larger ships that were too heavy to enter the harbors. It is likely that the use of these larger ships likewise made it harder to make the journey to the east. It appears as if the Gotlanders stopped traveling farther than Novgorod by the late 11th century. In this century, the town of Visby cropped into a trading metropolis. The farmen faded out of existence, but as an act of necessity. The farmen, as a combined profession of farmer and merchant, split in two. The farmer became a man of the countryside, and the merchant a man of the city. The farmer could sell his goods to the merchant in the city, make as much money, and not risk leaving his holdings for lengthy periods of time. Some speculate that in the first split, the farmer and merchants may have been related. one man might travel abroad and live in a city, whilst his brother tends the farm. The farmen across Scandinavia were early adapters of Christianity, since this allowed them to trade more easily with Christians in places such as London. The farmen on Gotland were no different. They used their wealth to build churches on the island, the first one around 1040. Anga Church, built in the second half of the 13th century, contains the names of the farmers and workers that helped raise the church. Their names were painted into the church entrance in the Gotländsk language and the runic alphabet. However, the Pope would occasionally complain about the farmen trading with heathen peoples, such as the Finns, Karelians, Ingrians, and Orthodox heretics of Russia. This gave them access to Christian goods and technology like weapons, horses, and ships. The Gotlanders ignored these complaints. They had been doing this trade for hundreds of years, and it made them a lot of money. Some historians even believe that farm trade helped in Christianizing Finland. The pagan locals were just so impressed by the wealth of these Christian traders. This was not all too different from how the farmen themselves were Christianized. Whilst this does challenge the pop culture narrative of Finland being Christianized by force, it would not have been very different from how Scandinavia was Christianized. And the farmen themselves. The Gotlanders' mercantile culture would persist well into the Middle Ages. They had trading offices in places like Novgorod, Lübeck, and even London. In London, Gotnish names appear much more frequently in period records than Germans or Frisians. However, by this point, Scandinavians were losing their grip as the trade masters of Europe. In the 11th century, the Germans and Frisians used Viking shipbuilding to produce the cog, a ship that could carry more cargo and defend itself from pirates. Evidence points to the cog being used in trade with the Norse. A special place in Birka was called the Cog Harbour, indicating a place for the Germans to dock their ships. The saga sometimes mentions cogs as being used by Nordic merchants, though rarely. The Scandinavians had lost their edge. The German merchants banded together into a trade conglomerate known as the Hansa. They would come to utterly dominate Scandinavian trade. The Scandinavian languages have many German loanwords, which were brought in by Hanseatic merchants. Their influence varied from country to country. In Norway, a very centralized country, Germans weren't allowed to marry the natives, for example. In Sweden, which was little more than a federation of provinces, Germans pretty much did as they pleased. On Gotland, Germans, Frisians, and even Russians established their own little colonies in the city of Visby. As the Middle Ages developed, the city would become entirely dominated by Germans. In 1288, Gotland found itself in a civil war, believed by some to be caused by a disconnect between the city and the countryside. By now, the farmen had long since disappeared.
Huge thanks to Bradley Roder, my first supporter on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the video description. Otherwise, boost the algorithm by giving the video a like and a comment, and sharing it with a friend. Cheers!